Welcome to today's webinar, Strategies for Coastal Resilience, How Communities Need to Adapt, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on behalf of the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I am Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and we'll post it on our website early next week under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get smart growth news and information and learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. In addition, today's webinar is offered with assistance from Island Press and their partnership coordinator, Jen Hawes. For more information about Island Press, their catalog, podcasts, and upcoming publications, visit islandpress.org. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Strategies for Coastal Resilience, How Communities Need to Adapt. You can also search for event number 919-6746. So to get started, today our speakers are Jeffrey Peterson and Katie Spidalieri. Jeffrey Peterson is the author of A New Coast, Strategies for Responding to Devastating Storms and Rising Seas, published by Island Press in 2019. Jeff has 40 years of experience in environmental policy development and program management, particularly focused on water issues. Most recently, he was a senior advisor in the Environmental Protection Agency Office of Water, responsible for climate change policy. He co-chaired the EPA Sea Level Rise Work Group and was a member of the Federal Interagency Sea Level Rise Work Group. He also worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality during the first Obama term. At the CEQ, he co-chaired the Interagency Water Resources and Climate Change Work Group and authored the first national plan addressing water resources management and climate change. Katie Spidalieri is a senior associate at the Georgetown Climate Center in Washington, D.C., where she provides legal and policy analysis on adaptation at the federal, state, and local levels. Her work focuses on adaptation in the coastal sector, including evaluating land use and other tools and strategies to adapt to sea level rise, flooding, and land loss. Katie is leading the development of the Georgetown Climate Center's forthcoming Managed Retreat Toolkit, which will serve as an online resource featuring legal and policy tools and case studies for state and local jurisdictions that are considering relocating development away from vulnerable coastal areas. Katie also contributes content to the GCC's Adaptation Clearinghouse, an online database and networking site that serves policymakers and others who are working to help communities adapt to climate change. Katie previously worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and state environmental agencies in Maryland and North Carolina in the areas of permitting, environmental compliance, offshore energy and infrastructure development, land use, and community engagement. She's also worked in outreach and place-based management and national marine sanctuaries and marine national monuments. Following today's presentation, Jeff and Katie will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time during their presentations by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Oh, actually, before we do that, we have a couple of poll questions. We usually turn it over directly, but we're going to ask you all a few things relative to who's online today. So we're going to open the first question. You'll be able to respond to it momentarily. So here's the first question is, at what level are you working? And the responses are local, state, federal, and other. We'll give you a little bit of time to respond and then we'll show the responses. Okay, we're going to close it. So now you can see that about 47% are local, 26 other, 19% state, and 7% federal. Okay, our next poll question. Do you work on issues around coastal planning? Yes, no, or sometimes? And we'll close it momentarily here. So it looks like most everybody is dealing with this at least a little bit. 44% sometimes, 33% yes, and only 22% no. And our, doing one more? Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff. We will have another poll question for you all later.
Well, good afternoon. Is my screen coming through okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction and for the chance to talk to such a great audience. I want to give a quick sketch of how more severe storms and rising seas will redraw and redefine the American coast. And I want to describe some ideas for new policies and programs that are needed to adapt to these changes. As Michael said, much of what I'm talking about today is drawn from my book, A New Coast, published in last November by Island Press. The American coast is changing, and most of the changes, be they warmer water or shifting fisheries or changing ocean chemistry, can be traced back to a changing climate. But the most dramatic impact of climate change is the altering of patterns of coastal storms, including hurricanes that pose a particular risk to the Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic coasts. In the summer of 2017, hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria devastated the American coast in the space of 3 weeks, exacting a staggering toll in lives and lost homes and damaged communities. Here's a slide of widespread flooding in Port Arthur, Texas during Hurricane Harvey. And here's Coast Guard rescue during Hurricane Irma, and a shot of disaster relief in Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria. Then in 2018, Hurricane Michael strengthened rapidly before barreling into the panhandle of Florida and virtually wiping some communities off the map. This is Mexico Beach, Florida. I was actually in Mexico Beach last month, and I got a chance to look at some of the rebuilding works still underway now, a couple of years later. Here's a house in sort of mid-construction stage. Here's a roof, sides going up with new foundation right on the beach. A lot of folks are still in trailers, though, both residents and people doing work. And here's a shot of the roof shingles going on, rebuilding project right next to the shore there. Unfortunately, scientists agree that climate change is likely to cause an increase in the number of the most severe storms. And the most dangerous and damaging part of a coastal storm is the flooding resulting from storm surges. The more extreme storms will push bigger surges ashore, causing wider damage and loss of life. In addition, future major storms are expected to generate more rainfall and to intensify more rapidly, making them harder to predict. But there have been coastal storms for years, and they randomly strike an area, they do their damage, and they move on, allowing rebuilding, like here in Mexico Beach, to begin. Today, there's another factor to consider. Future storms will ride on top of higher sea levels and then reach further inland, further than ever before. Not only do rising seas bring more extensive storm surge, they occur everywhere along the coast. And worst of all, the inundation stays. It doesn't drain away after the storm passes and effectively pushes the shoreline inland. Just how much sea level rise are we talking about? Here is a chart from a 2000 and 2017 NOAA report showing projected future sea levels out to the year 2100 under some different scenarios. You can see it shows a wide range, everything from 1 foot to 8 feet, based on some uncertainty about the models and about the rate of warming that'll occur over that time period. To make a long story short, there's a reasonable chance of 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100. Predicting future global sea level rise involves accounting for thermal expansion of the ocean, melting of glaciers around the world, as well as loss of ice sheets on Greenland and in the Arctic and Antarctic. Here's a photo of the Pine Island Glacier, one of the largest ice sheets in Antarctica. It's important to note that in just the last several years, the scientific community has increased estimates of future global sea level rise, and new research suggests that this upward trend will continue. In fact, just last month, we learned that a chunk of Pine Island Glacier, about the size of the District of Columbia, broke off. Remember that this is global sea level rise we're talking about, and unfortunately, sea level rise along the American coast is expected to be higher than the global average. This is due to the coincidence of ocean currents and geography, but most particularly to land subsidence. And of course, keep in mind that sea level rise will continue for several centuries after 2100, even though 2100 is the most common target year for a lot of studies. Even if we agreed that future coastal storms will be more severe, that sea level will rise, it's still fair to ask, why is all this a problem? Let's assume roughly 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That would inundate 12,000 square miles of the United States that's now home to 3.5 million people. Hundreds of communities would be inundated in whole or in part, and flooding is already beginning in low-lying communities. Here's a photo of high tide flooding in Miami. And here's flooding in the rural community of Smith Island in the Chesapeake Bay. The cost of more severe storms and rising seas has been calculated to be as high as $3 trillion by 2100, although the timely implementation of adaptation measures would reduce these costs. And the costs and damage estimates are based on the population that is along the coast today, not the population that will be there by the year 2100. Coastal population in the 100-year coastal floodplain is expected to double by 2060. Here's a photo showing the intensive coastal development already in place. This is Palm Beach, Florida. And it's not just homes and communities at risk. Beaches and wetlands will be inundated, and Some may shift inland if not constrained by geography or development. Here's a shot of the Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge, extensive wetlands down there outside of San Diego. And here's a beach along the New Jersey coast. No one really knows how the US wetlands and beaches will survive rising seas. There are estimates of loss of 30% of Gulf of Mexico wetlands by 2050 and over 60% of California beaches by 2100, but there are no consistent national estimates. In addition to ecosystems, critical infrastructure ranging from energy to transportation to water infrastructure and military bases are also at risk. Here's a shot of the Turkey Point nuclear power station in southern Florida. And here is some damage to transportation infrastructure along the New Jersey coast after Hurricane Sandy. And here is the Norfolk Naval Station, a shot that gives you an idea of its vulnerability to storm surges and rising seas. Given the costs and the losses in store for the coast, it seems important to ask, are we prepared and ready to adapt? The good news is that some state and local governments have assessed risks from storms and rising seas and developed response plans, and some have moved toward implementation. At the federal level, Congress has appropriated hundreds of billions of dollars for relief from major coastal storms, but made a comparatively small investment in preparing for a future of more severe storms and rising seas. Today, there is no national program designed to comprehensively manage coastal storm and sea level rise risks, and we're not adequately prepared. So what is to be done? In the book, I talk about 3 types of strategies that can help prepare for storm and sea level rise risks. State and local governments are on the front lines of this challenge and have choices to make. The private sector contributes to the problem of unwise and risky coastal development and has a role to play in reducing risks. And finally, the federal government is making investments in disaster response and coastal management, but has not yet focused effectively on reducing risks from storms and rising seas. In the interest of time, I want to say just a few words about state and local choices and the private sector, and then focus mostly on what the federal government needs to do to get on top of this problem. In the case of state and local government, preparing for these risks is hard because the challenges are novel and there's no playbook to follow. Communities generally need to shift their thinking about flooding as a problem that is temporary and random geographically to one that is everywhere in a permanent state of inundation. There are legal consequences, some of them novel, in response that arise in response to government actions in this area, including issues related to constitutional takings. There are financial impacts on property owners and on municipal budgets. And communities need to consider how to decommission and remove inundated buildings and infrastructure. And effective planning for these risks requires extending the normal 20-year planning horizon to more like 50 to 100 years. And finally, it's hard to know what to plan for because there's no official end to the rising seas. Not surprisingly, all of these challenges have resulted in some reluctance to come to grips with the problem. This is a cartoon from North Carolina, which has had some difficulty in political debate in this area. State and local governments have made important progress in preparing for storms and rising seas, but the record is spotty. Here's a list of some of the tools that state and local governments can use. They can start by simply building awareness and education about the risks. They can move on to planning, either just for storms, but really much better to plan for both storms and rising seas together. They can spend money on projects like beach renourishment or seawalls, and they can change tax policy to influence development. Then there are a range of regulatory tools focused on where to build or what to build, and regulating design of private coastal protection structures. Regulations and money are most commonly spent on protection measures. Here is a picture of a beach renourishment project in progress. Money is also commonly spent on hard structures like seawalls. Here's the picture of a seawall in, this happens to be Galveston, Texas. Another strategy is accommodating floodwaters. Here's a home being elevated as a result of regulations. A final idea that we need to mention here is the option of relocating to safer ground in the face of storms and rising seas. This is a controversial approach, partly because it goes against the human impulse of resilience in the face of a natural disaster and the desire to rebuild everything back to the way it was before the storm hit. Unfortunately, sea level rise changes that equation and makes rebuilding along the original coastline a very debatable proposition. There are some small buyout programs today, mostly funded with disaster relief appropriations, but very few organized or managed relocation efforts. Most communities start with the idea of structural protection, and that approach may work in some places for a while. But as the costs of major projects that cope with rising seas become more evident, communities will face these hard choices about how much to spend and who to protect, and they may be taking a look at another look at relocation. Relocation also may look more promising when it's considered in light of larger plans for relocating critical infrastructure and migrating ecosystems. But stepping back to look at the state and local planning picture, the consensus of most experts who've studied this is that the state and local work to date on the whole is commendable, but not enough. It's largely improvisational. It tends to be underfunded. It's mostly uncoordinated with neighbors and with ecosystems and with infrastructures. The private sector can do a lot to reduce coastal flood risks. Professionals, lawyers, realtors, engineers, insurance agents, bankers, all have ethical codes of conduct that require them to disclose risks and not make false statements of material facts. They could significantly improve the transparency of coastal property transactions and stabilize the coastal property financial sector. Corporations are required to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission risks of climate change, not just to their financial health, but to physical assets. But this reporting is very spotty and definitely needs improvement. Finally, private businesses of all sizes could provide leadership at the local level in addressing storms and rising seas, simply by acknowledging the problem and joining in finding solutions. The private sector and state and local governments can do a lot to prepare for storms and rising seas, but For the country to make significant progress toward reducing costs, the loss of life will require that the federal government expand its existing coastal management and disaster relief efforts and develop new policies and programs to build resilience. I propose 5 major new efforts. First is to build new leadership capacity. The second is to revise current flood insurance and disaster programs. The third is to adopt new coastal storm and sea level rise policies. Fourth, to develop national plans for ecosystems and infrastructure resilience along the coast. And finally, a major effort to support state and community planning for storms and rising seas. So federal leadership is needed to set a national direction and harness federal resources to support state and local efforts. A National Council of Federal Agencies and a Public Advisory Committee are needed. Research into storms and rising seas needs to be expanded and better coordinated, as does mapping of coastal areas at risk. The old business on the agenda here is for Congress to substantially revise and update both the flood insurance and the disaster relief programs. Both programs are sending coastal property owners misleading, even counterproductive messages. In the case of flood insurance, the message is that it's okay to stay in risky areas. A better message is that it's time to step back from areas at risk of permanent inundation by rising seas. To make that happen, the federal government should stop issuing insurance for new development in areas at risk of rising seas, and then gradually phase out insurance in these risky areas over the coming decades. The message of the disaster relief program is that the federal government will come with significant funds to rebuild pretty much what was there before the storm. We need a new message that federal and state governments will shift investments to better prepare for future disasters, future coastal disasters driven by rising seas as much as major storms. One idea is to adopt a disaster deductible approach where states that make investments in avoiding disasters get a more generous share of federal assistance. In addition to updating existing programs, we need some new policies. One thing we need to do right away is adopt a national standard for disclosure of risk related to both flooding and sea level rise at the time of sale of a property. We also need to strengthen corporate climate risk disclosure requirements and add sea level information to existing flood maps. The current dramatic growth in coastal areas at risk of rising seas is making a difficult and costly problem much worse. Fortunately, there is time to put controls in place to direct new development away from these risky areas toward higher ground. Phasing out the promise of federal flood insurance in these risky areas is a first step, but additional measures are needed, including a national requirement for permits for development in areas at risk of rising seas. When new development in risky areas is approved, developers should post a bond to pay for the eventual removal of buildings and related infrastructure. And the federal government needs to remove property abandoned to rising oceans as a last resort. And we need to clarify when land inundated by rising seas changes ownership and to what extent the government will be held responsible for costs related to any limits on development. So the third kind of major idea is that there's a need for a new national planning process to better prepare for the combined effects of bigger storm surges and the permanent inundation that comes with rising seas. And a key part of this new planning process should be leadership by federal agencies in protecting coastal ecosystems and critical infrastructure. In the case of infrastructure, federal agencies need to develop plans for transportation, energy, water, and defense assets. In the case of ecosystems, the Department of Interior should develop an atlas of coastal mapping, providing coastal mapping of ecosystems and articulating and mapping where these ecosystems will migrate to as seas rise, and then define actions needed to protect those migration areas in coordination with community plans. Finally, the federal government needs to provide grants to state and large metropolitan areas to work with local governments to decide how to prepare for both storms and rising seas. These state plans need to cope with questions including whether to hold the coastline in place or step back to higher ground, how to pay for response actions, and how to be sure that disadvantaged populations are treated fairly. And state and local plans need to be coordinated with the plans of other jurisdictions and with national planning for ecosystems and infrastructure. A major new effort to prepare for more severe storms and rising seas will not be cheap. We need to expand funding for existing programs such as Coastal Zone Management Program, and the Federal Flood Insurance Program is operating at a loss and is almost sure to require major new appropriations in the probable event of future major storms. We also need funding for new efforts such as state grants for planning and implementation of response actions and for decommissioning and removing property abandoned to rising seas. And we need a major new investment to buy properties at risk of rising seas well ahead of storm damage and eventual inundation. This federal investment could be reduced somewhat by allowing leasebacks until the property is no longer safe. All this is somewhere in the range of $10 to $15 billion a year, which is a lot of money. But remember, the value of property at risk is in the trillions of dollars, and federal appropriations for the 3 major storms in 2017 came to $120 billion. Beyond the monetary savings, better preparedness will save lives, sustain coastal ecosystems, and support local economies. An expensive new federal effort to help coastal states and communities prepare for more severe storms and rising seas is not likely to just happen. People who care about the coast need to make the case to governments at all levels that a major new effort is needed. The existing nonprofit and professional organizations that are already engaged in coastal work need to get organized and ramp up efforts to press Congress and other governments to take action on storms and rising seas more specifically. And finally, citizens need to get engaged at the local level and advocate for new investments at the national level. So in conclusion, the coast that we know today, that we've known really for centuries, will no longer exist 100 years from now. There's nothing we can do to change that. We can manage the transition to a new coast, more smartly, saving lives, reducing costs, and migrating ecosystems and managing major infrastructure investments. And we can design a new coast with our values in mind, values like addressing interests of rich and poor alike, of preserving cultural heritage and community identity and making space for ecosystems. And we can try and make the coast of the future better, safer for deadly storms and the trauma and destruction they bring, more environmentally friendly, more accessible, more socially just. It seems likely that the experience of future coastal storms and relentlessly rising seas will eventually summon from the political process a will to prepare for these challenges. Less clear is whether this action will come too late to avoid the most serious impacts and to reap the benefits of timely action. Mark Twain remarked that wisdom is the reward you get for a lifetime of listening when you would rather have talked. So I think at this point, I will stop talking and pass the microphone to Katie.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Gotcha. I don't know where I got cut off. I was on and then unmuted. But we're going to transition to looking at some state and local opportunities for implementing some of the solutions that Jeff teed up. Before we start my presentation, though, we have a third poll question for everyone. Let's see, is the poll going up or do people still see my screen?
Okay, the responses are up now. Are you able to discuss managed retreat as a possibility for coastal resilience? And 38% said yes, we can. 22% said no, it's not politically feasible. 37% not sure, and no is only 2%.
Gotcha. All right, well, I appreciate that awareness of everyone's familiarity with managed retreat, and we'll use that as a platform to get started. All right, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great, we'll get started. So thanks so much to the Smart Growth Network, Island Press, and Jeff for the opportunity to speak with you all today on this important issue and share some work that we're doing at the Georgetown Climate Center on coastal resilience and adaptation. Okay. So as an overview of the presentation I'll be giving, we're going to just talk on some additional basics to build on Jeff's presentation to make sure everyone is familiar with some coastal adaptation and legal terminology. Then I'll transition into talking about some state and local planning and legal and policy tools that people could consider if they're adapting to climate change in a coastal environment. Then we'll round things out by looking at some of the bigger picture legal questions that state and local policymakers specifically may want to ask if they're interested in potentially developing and implementing any of these tools with a focus on the question of takings private property rights. And then I'll conclude with an introduction to some work that Georgetown Climate Center is doing on managed retreat specifically. So for those of you who don't know about the Climate Center, we have been around for 11 years. And we serve as a climate law and policy resource for states and communities. We work in both the areas of climate mitigation for reducing emissions from the transportation and energy sectors, and also adaptation to help states and communities prepare for different impacts from climate change, like sea level rise. We're associated here with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and to serve the policymakers that we support. We provide a variety of resources, for example, by serving as a convener, but we also work to develop and maintain a variety of online tools. Our flagship resource is called the Adaptation Clearinghouse. It's available at adaptationclearinghouse.org. And through the Clearinghouse, it's really a one-stop shop for literally thousands of adaptation resources, from examples of the legal and policy tools that I'll be talking about today, to examples of plans and case studies of jurisdictions that have used these tools. So it's a good peer learning resource if you're interested in finding out something that might work in your jurisdiction. We also maintain in the bottom right-hand corner a state and local adaptation progress tracker, which is a good oversight and overview of how states across the country with adaptation plans are implementing those adaptation plans. And we also develop and maintain a variety of resources that we call toolkits, which are essentially sort of subject matter-based resources that really do a deep dive into a specific subject like green infrastructure you see on the screen, and provide legal and policy tools that jurisdictions can consider for that subject, and also highlight the policy trade-offs and best practices that we're observing around the nation that could be adapted to state and local jurisdictions. The Managed Retreat Toolkit is an example of one that's currently in development, and as I mentioned, I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. So taking things from a higher to a more specific level, and just making sure everyone is on the same page in terms of terminology. Generally in the coastal sector, there's sort of 3 adaptation responses that get attention, and the terminology you see on the screen is what's most often used to describe those responses. So we have protect in the bottom left in red, which is traditionally sort of hard shoreline armoring structures, which is basically sort of keeping water or keeping the risk back. In the top left, you'll see accommodate, which is the idea of really like living with water. So you acknowledge that there's a risk and you may stay in place, but you're trying to reduce the risk that you may be facing from sea level rise, flooding, or land loss. So those strategies tend to be either elevating structures or potentially flood-proofing structures. The third strategy off to the right is retreat, which is also known by many names. Jeff referred to it as relocate. And that's the idea of basically moving away from the water when it's necessary. And in the process of doing that, you're not just thinking about, potentially moving privately owned structures like homes, but also publicly owned infrastructure. And then what are the impacts of facilitating transitions away from the coast for people and ecosystems as well. I start with these 3 options to not advocate for any of them or against any of them, but basically to try and set up a discussion that adaptation at the federal, state, and local level should ideally have all 3 of these potential responses on the table at the beginning of decision-making processes, so that way policymakers and communities can decide what is best suited for a given area, and it will enable them to make better, more proactive decisions rather than potentially thinking about one later after certain costs have materialized. So transitioning from 3 adaptation responses to thinking about how is land use and development regulated in the coastal sector. So for those of you who are newer to coastal planning, the idea of how the coastal sector is regulated is a little bit different than a traditional terrestrial ecosystem. So upland and sort of approaching the tidal area, local governments generally have primary authority through land use and zoning powers. And they may even have sort of a local coastal program, depending on if authority is delegated from the state to local governments. In the intertidal area out into the ocean or bays or estuaries, states primarily have primary authority to manage those areas through laws like coastal management laws and wetland laws. Once you get from the intertidal area out further to the ocean or bays or estuaries, the federal government can come in with jurisdiction through statutes like the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act for discharges to federally managed waters. This is an oversimplification of regulation of the coastal environment. For example, the federal government could have jurisdiction in state and local areas or territories through natural resource statutes like the Endangered Species Act. But this is just a good starter to remind everyone of all the different players at the local, state, and federal level that come into these types of decisions, and all the different laws that also may come into play. So when you're sitting down at the start of those decision-making processes and you're looking at potential protect, accommodation and retreat strategies, who should you also have at that table, and what types of laws do you want to sort of think about early on, so that way there aren't potential barriers to decision-making processes later down the road. So starting in with the examples, we're going to journey to Rhode Island with an example of what's called a special area management plan. Under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, special area management plans are essentially sort of resource-specific management plans that states can enact to better manage specific geographic areas. Rhode Island's Shorelines Change Special Area Management Plan, that's a mouthful, or Beach SAMP, is the first of its kind in the nation. And in 2018, the state created this plan to cover the entire state's coastline and serve essentially as guidance for its coastal management agency and local governments evaluating coastal development in response to climate impacts like sea level rise. The plan includes a lot of novel features, but one of them is that it includes guidance which was ultimately implemented through the state's coastal regulations to require applicants to include a coastal hazard analysis or checklist with new development or substantial redevelopment permit applications to demonstrate their awareness of the risks that are in the coastal space from sea level rise, storm surge, and coastal erosion, and then to ultimately incorporate, hopefully, risk mitigation measures into project design and development. So for example, for infrastructure that's going to have a long lifespan on the coast, as Jeff mentioned through some of his examples, how can project applicants design that infrastructure to either keep it further set back from potential threats or make it potentially relocatable in the future if these threats materialize. A novel example of coastal policies from the state of Hawaii is a feasibility report on managed retreat that the state released in 2019. This study was the result of a working group effort to achieve goals from the state to look at improving coastal development and management of coastal hazards. So originally the state set out to develop what they would think of would be a managed retreat policy or program for the state. However, in conducting a literature review of places that have examples of managed retreat and engaging stakeholders throughout this process, the state ultimately determined that it was too soon and essentially was putting the cart before the horse to jump right to creating a managed retreat program. As a result, this feasibility study that the state created allows them to have sort of now a foundation to go forward if they ultimately do end up pursuing some type of managed retreat policy or program. Some interesting features of the report include sort of a take that Hawaii did to really think about retreat in the context of Hawaii itself and not some overgeneralized concept of retreat that wouldn't fit the specific jurisdiction of Hawaii, which is an important takeaway that retreat discussions really need to be local and place-based to find out what legal and policy tools may fit a specific jurisdiction. So with that, the state in this feasibility study created what they call 4 scenarios, which are really land use typologies for some different areas in Hawaii. The 4 typologies were for single family homes, resorts, hotels and condominiums, urban areas, and as you see on the screen, critical infrastructure. So for example, where you have critical infrastructure, but a potential opportunity to maybe relocate structures back because there's open space, there might be different legal tools open to a state or local government compared to ones where if you imagine the cliffs and the mountains are further towards the coast and you have dense development, maybe retreat isn't feasible in that circumstance, and so you might consider other protection or accommodation options. Transitioning from state examples to local level examples, we're going to look at 2 levels examples of planning from the Hampton Roads region in Virginia. So in Norfolk, Virginia, the city drafted a long-term visioning or strategy document called Norfolk Vision 2100. Vision 2100 is different from the state's, the local government's comprehensive plan, and basically allows the local government to think about planning for impacts from climate change and sea level rise over a longer term horizon out to 2100 compared to typical local planning cycles, which might be 5 to 10 years. One facet of Norfolk Vision 2100 was that the local government essentially mapped out the risk and also the development patterns throughout the city to use those 3 different adaptation responses to guide future land use and zoning decisions. So in the red, you have an area where there's a lot of infrastructure that the city will seek to protect, including naval infrastructure. In the yellow areas, those are areas where Norfolk will seek to accommodate sea level rise and flooding. And in the green and purple areas, those are areas where they will seek to try and encourage new development from areas where they might try and disincentivize development along the coast. Norfolk 2100 ultimately helped to inform updates to the local government's zoning and land use ordinance in 2019. And so this is an example of local planning in a coastal adaptation context leading to action on the ground. So a couple unique features of the new zoning and land use ordinance. The ordinance includes sort of a heightened freeboard requirement, saying basically that construction in the 100-year floodplain must be elevated at least 3 feet above the 100-year base flood elevation, and construction in the 500-year floodplain, which isn't always regulated by local governments, be elevated or flood-proofed to 1.5 feet above the 500-year floodplain elevation. The government also built on sort of those red, yellow and blue, purple and green areas to create different overlay zones, one along the coast to try and disincentivize or discourage new development, and then also one in an upland resilience area to try and encourage new denser development away from those vulnerable areas on the coast. As you see on the screen, the zoning and land use ordinance also developed what's called a resilience quotient system, which is essentially a point system that permit applicants have to meet to attain a certain number of minimum points in 3 different categories for risk reduction, energy resilience, and stormwater management to demonstrate that by getting a development permit, their new development will be resilient and not contribute to, for example, flooding threats in an area. So some ways that people can meet these different requirements include using solar power, elevating mechanical equipment on the roof so that way it's not exposed to flooding, and also meeting sort of minimum open space requirements to not contribute to flooding. So a neighboring local government in Virginia Beach is in the process of finalizing its long-term sea level rise adaptation strategy. The strategy ultimately applies adaptation tools differently to 4 different watersheds, as you see on the screen, to the city based on the development patterns in each of these watersheds, and also 5 different types of flood risk. The 5 different types of flood risk Virginia Beach identified as facing include high tide flooding, wind tide flooding, which is when winds blow persistently in one direction for multiple days, pushing water into coastal bays and waterways, and then causes flooding in low-lying areas. The 3rd type of flooding is storm surge flooding, rainfall or compound flooding. So when precipitation is happening at the time another type of flooding is happening, it exacerbates the results of that flooding, and groundwater flooding. I basically evaluated these in each of the specific contexts of the watershed. That basically is giving the city a framework to evaluate how they would approach adaptation in each watershed. So for example, in the oceanfront watershed, which is the city's smallest and densest and most flood-prone watershed, adaptation strategies will focus on armoring and creating dunes to protect existing development, which serves as the community's economic base, and also encouraging development in new, safer, higher ground areas. That's somewhat in contrast to, for example, the city's Southern River's watershed, which is just largest and also has the largest amount of low-lying land in Virginia Beach. The framework here suggests developing new land use strategies that can protect natural resources and limit new development in areas prone to flooding. So moving on from planning to implementation, other types of implementation tools, buyouts are a tool that in the adaptation context and increasingly with retreat are getting a lot of attention. Charlotte-Mecklenburg County Stormwater Services in North Carolina is an example of a long-running buyout program that operates in both a pre and post-disaster context. One of the reasons why the program is able to operate in a pre-disaster context is because it has a local source of funding that can be used for buyouts. The local government uses stormwater fees in addition to federal mitigation grants to buy out its most flood-prone properties. As a result of this, the program has been able to attract participants for buyouts on a much larger scale than if they would be limited to federal disaster recovery sources of funding. So if you compare the images on the left and right of your screen, you can see sort of the scale or span of what this program has been able to accomplish in one area of its floodplain. What's also great about the program is that it works with engaging local property owners from the start. Buyouts are completely voluntary, and then works with them also to develop what might be done on the bought out properties after demolition is completed. So this is an opportunity for a local government to turn what potentially was a flood hazard risk into a beneficial opportunity for communities by creating passive recreational amenities like trails or parks, and also reaping the flood risk reduction benefits and ecosystem benefits as well. At one point, a figure for the county estimated that after spending about $15 million in buying out properties, like you see on your right, engineers sort of had a back of the envelope calculation that these costs of future flood damages would essentially have been 400% higher than the cost of buying these property out. So basically there was a 400% return on investment for that $15 million spent. In addition to buyouts, setbacks are another tool that could be used to facilitate retreat in a coastal environment. Setbacks are often used on properties where they're larger and there's an opportunity to move development back away from coastal hazards or threats, particularly in rural areas. It might be more difficult in areas where you have smaller size lots. In the county of Kauai, the county has one of the most progressive examples of setbacks in the country, and it's based on scientific studies to determine erosion rates the island is facing. The erosion rate is based on the average annual erosion rate and a planning period of 70 to 100 years that depends on the size of the building or development footprint, plus a minimum buffer of 40 feet. Having setbacks also allows the coastal environment to sort of maintain its natural connections with the water and not be cut off. So speaking of coastal environments, we've been talking a lot about structures, but in thinking about coastal adaptation and especially retreat, as Jeff was teeing up, there's also the living components for ecosystems and people. So my last couple slides on the tools at the local level are going to focus on that. So Yankeetown is a small town in Florida that derives a lot of its sort of pride and economic value from ecotourism due to the presence of salt marshes and forests. The local government used a state overlay district tool called an adaptation action area, which allows it to apply increased management attention to a specific area within its zoning ordinance. This natural resource adaptation action area that the local government created covers 86% of the town and basically allows the local government to think about new development in a way that's going to facilitate marsh and forest migration. So for example, the plan that includes discussion of the overlay district and also an updated zoning ordinance looks at how development can either be not cited in migration pathways, or if it is permitted and it will be cited in those pathways, how it can help accommodate marsh migration or forest migration. So for example, could you elevate a home to allow marshes to migrate? In addition, through this process, the local government also looked to prioritize potential future acquisitions of land that could keep development out of the way of these marsh migration pathways. Another opportunity to protect ecosystems is through the use of a transfer of development rights, or TDR program. So a TDR program is a market-based land use tool that enables local governments to disincentivize development in environmentally vulnerable areas, which are called sending areas, and encourage development in safer receiving areas, as they're called. So in practice, a TDR program really depends on a local government designating these vulnerable sending areas and these areas called receiving areas where they want to encourage new development. So it allows landowners in the high risk sending areas to sell their development rights to support development in higher ground receiving areas with less flood risk. One example of a successful TDR program is in the Pine Barrens in New York, where a program was created to protect water quality and the ecologically sensitive Pine Barrens ecosystems by allowing people to sell development rights from the Pine Barrens ecosystem to transfer that development to other receiving areas. transfer of development rights in a coastal context are rare, and I am currently not aware of any that have been specifically developed to deal with sea level rise. But the idea of a TDR program to counteract sea level rise has been getting a lot of attention nationally. New York State recently passed a bill that would allow local governments to protect lands at risk from sea level rise, storm surge, or flooding. So it'll be interesting to see potential use of this tool going forward. And lastly, that second living element of adaptation and retreat decisions is really thinking about people. And part of, especially retreat decisions, is not just the thought of getting people out of harm's way, but where are they going? And are they going to somewhere where they will be safer? And is it potentially a higher ground area? And will they be able to thrive there and have, sufficient affordable housing, for example, or infrastructure or community services? The concept of thinking about where people are going is thinking about receiving communities. Receiving communities are areas to where people relocate, and they can be within the same jurisdiction, maybe where they're being bought out voluntarily, or it could be on a more regional basis. Louisiana is one of the states that's thinking regionally about adaptation. Louisiana is the US state experiencing the fastest rate of coastal land loss in the nation. To complement its comprehensive coastal management planning, the state implemented what's called the Louisiana Strategic Adaptation for Future Environment, or LA-SAFE program, which is essentially a capital investment and planning process that's informed by communities' engagement and information and education. So that way residents in the 6 affected parishes that you see on the screen could learn about the climate risks that they're facing and be involved firsthand in developing potential new adaptation projects in those regions to help prepare for climate change and land loss. As a result of LA-SAFE, the state funded 10 projects that were informed by community input and essentially were divided into 3 areas based on adaptation strategies or responses: protect, accommodate, or retreat, that were associated with different levels of flood risk. So in high flood risk areas, the projects were chosen to try and help get people out of harm's way. In moderate flood risk areas, projects were selected to think about accommodating the water and the threats that people were facing. And in low flood risk areas where the state and parishes may face increased development and population that's moving away from high risk areas, they'll look to fund projects, for example, maybe like a affordable housing prototype, so that way it can encourage new development. So rounding things out, if a jurisdiction is interested in implementing any type of adaptation tool, there's 3 basic legal questions they should ask first. So 1, do these jurisdictions even have the authority to do what they want to do? So if I am Yankeetown and I want to see if I can create an overlay district, do I have the authority to even do that through my land use and zoning powers? Yes, in Florida, the state passed a law that enabled local governments to create those overlay districts. So if you do have that authority, you can move to the second question. The second question is, will the tool or strategy that you're developing be compliant with federal and state laws? In this instance, coastal zone management acts and land use and zoning authorities will particularly play a role. And the third question is, will your action ultimately be compliant with federal and state constitutions? The question that often comes up from policymakers is whether their actions will potentially conflict with the US Constitution's 5th Amendment prohibition against the taking of private property for public use without just compensation. This protection for private property rights is also included in states' constitutions. We're going to quickly take a look at 2 of the most likely taking claims that might come up under federal law, and that will affect state and local decisions to restrict or prohibit development in coastal areas, and then we'll walk through a case study example. And I know we're running up on time here, so I will move through these quickly. All right, so the Lucas or per se takings rule comes out of a case from South Carolina where a property owner owned 2 coastal lots in the Isle of Palms. After he bought the properties, South Carolina passed a law that prohibited the construction of residential properties on the lots. The US Supreme Court found that South Carolina's law had deprived Lucas of all economically beneficial uses of his property, and thus a per se takings had occurred where the government owed this private property owner compensation. So if a takings doesn't rise to the level of a per se takings, a property owner could still allege that what's called a regulatory takings has occurred. The US Supreme Court developed a 3-factor test to determine if a regulatory takings has occurred. This 3-factor balancing test is applied on a case-by-case basis, and so the results determined based on the facts that are in each case. But the 3 factors to determine a regulatory takings include whether a government's action was ultimately implemented for a legitimate and reasonable public purpose, to what extent is the regulation affected a private property owner's economic value, and what are the property owner's investment-backed expectations in a property. So applying this to a fact pattern to make it more understandable, we go up to Massachusetts. The town of Chatham created an overlay district like we saw in Yankeetown throughout its entire 100-year floodplain and called it a conservancy district. In the conservancy district, new residential development was prohibited and only permitted uses like recreational and water-dependent activities. A homeowner in the conservancy district, after the district was created, wanted to sell her home, and she received an offer on her home, but that offer was contingent upon this new homeowner being able to get a development permit to build a home on her lot. When Chatham denied that person's development permit, the property owner sued, alleging both a Lucas per se takings, or if not that, then a Penn Central regulatory takings. This case went all the way up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in favor of the government, basically saying that neither type of takings had occurred. Under the Lucas per se test, the property still had economically beneficial uses. It just wasn't able to be used anymore for residential purposes. And under the Penn Central balancing test, the court found that the city had a legitimate public purpose because by establishing this conservancy district, it wanted to protect people and property from future flooding risks. The property still had economic value. And third, the property owner had no investment-backed expectations in the property because, again, this district was in place before this person decided to sell her property. So at least in Massachusetts, the Chatham case established that local governments have the ability to either regulate or prohibit development in vulnerable floodplains so long as the property maintains some type of economic value and the regulation serves a legitimate public interest. Takings law varies state by state, so this is one case from Massachusetts, but if you're interested in evaluating it in your own state, you need to evaluate your own state statutory and laws and case law. So the main takeaway is that takings is a legal challenge that policymakers need to consider. However, there are opportunities to minimize legal risk that the Chatham case illustrates. For example, in developing the Conservancy District in its local comprehensive plan, Chatham indicated and put together a good administrative record about why it was creating its Conservancy District to save people and prevent future damage to property. In addition, it's important to think about tailoring your legislative and regulatory decisions to the scale of the risk that is being faced. So for example, Chatham made this prohibition on residential development limited to its 100-year floodplain and didn't indiscriminately apply it elsewhere. So Georgetown is in the process of developing an online tool or resource called the Managed Retreat Toolkit that will feature many of the legal and policy tools we talked about today, in addition to others, and case studies of jurisdictions that are implementing those. Retreat will increasingly be an opportunity for coastal governments to think about whether or not this strategy is appropriate to adapt to sea level rise, and we're developing resources to help inform those decisions. Two key pieces of this that we didn't hit on today are sort of the funding and financing piece and how these decisions should be equitable and communities should be engaged. And so we look forward to basically putting together a comprehensive decision-making resource for practitioners on the ground. So if you have any questions about what we talked about today and don't have a chance to ask them during our Q&A session, or you would like more information about the toolkit or would like to be informed about future updates, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate that information, especially at the end, the legal questions. We may want to invite you, Katie, to do a legal webinar with us at some point. So just as a reminder, we have received a number of questions throughout the presentations. You can continue to submit them through the questions tab. We have that on the screen so you can take a look at what that is in case you'd like to send something in for the next 20 or so minutes. And I see that our presenters have opened up their webcam, so we're going to go ahead, hello Katie, and start the questions. So I'm going to actually start with one that we received kind of before we even did this one, because people have been interested in this topic. So I'm going to read it to you, and maybe both of you can respond. If there is time, be interested to hear ideas for coastal communities on the Great Lakes, where lake levels rise and fall and rise again several feet over the course of decades. When lake levels are low, the beaches and dunes advance lakeward and take on the appearance of permanent land. And when lake levels rise, these beaches and dunes and the houses, roads, etc., built on them during low water years are reclaimed by the lake. This happens over and over, but on a cycle of length that exceeds the memory of many people living in these communities. What can folks in those areas kind of do when we look at it, both not only in the short term, but in the long term like that? Jeff, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to keep a good record of the kinds of variations that are occurring along the coast, so that to the extent that there's a long time period and people move in and move away and don't really remember that the water went out into the lake, or the land stretched out further 20 or 30 years ago. It's really important to document that and make sure that that's generally understood, as well as to build that into local zoning and other kinds of protection programs. Really important thing being to be clear not to put major infrastructure or big developments into areas where they're that might look good today, but aren't effectively safe for people to be on a longer term basis.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything Jeff said, and I think part of the discussion in the Great Lakes, I'm biased, I'm actually from Ohio, so I like thinking about the Great Lakes in addition to our oceanic coasts. I think the challenges that are being faced on the Great Lakes are similar to those on oceanic coasts, and so a lot of the things that we've talked about today should be applied in those circumstances as well. So needing to address, as Jeff mentioned, the challenges between sort of short-term planning cycles versus longer-term planning cycles when you have the documentation of that longer term risk, and trying to build that also into your legal tools, land use and zoning, as Jeff mentioned, to try and look at what adaptation responses might be most appropriate. And a lot of this, I think, will depend on, thinking of the Great Lakes not as something that's completely different than coastal areas that's not facing sea level rise, but looking at it as an area where action potentially needs to occur. And then also, even under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, Great Lakes are considered coastal states, so they're eligible for that type of funding. But for Great Lakes states which may not have opportunities for federal disaster recovery funding, or aren't proactively thinking about how they can generate sustainable or more consistent sources of revenue for adaptation, that's something that would be needed to, I think, supplement the planning and legal piece, and also just engaging communities and educating them about this risk too. It may be less publicized than some of the big coastal storms and sea level rise you're seeing. So how do you get communities to support decisions that may need policy making?
Okay, thanks, Katie. We've had several questions about the webinar itself and your contact information. What we will be doing, as I mentioned earlier, is on our webinar archives page, we'll be posting the recording here. We'll also post the contact information for Jeff and Katie and any other materials and links that we can present that are relevant to the presentations. Another question for Jeff here. Can you talk about the integration of risk management planning into coastal flood plain management planning?
Yeah, sure. That's a big topic. I think probably the first thing to say is that it's really important to think about the totality of the risk, and a lot of planning that's been done in the past and still going on today along the coast, for instance, is funded and focused on looking at past disasters and trying to think through what would be a good strategy for avoiding what happened when the last storm came through. But while there's certainly value to looking at that, if you're not also considering issues like rising sea levels and the potential for permanent inundation in addition to strong storms and continuing storm surges, it's easy for the planning to sort of lose the focus on the risk and to perhaps go off in a wrong direction. One of the strategies Katie talked about, for instance, of accommodating future storm surges through elevating structures makes a lot of sense when you're looking at river flooding or perhaps storm surges from a hurricane. It makes less sense if the problem is understood as trying to deal with permanent water that's you're getting your feet wet all the time year round. Makes transportation, utilities, life in general so much harder when you factor in that permanent inundation. So really, I guess the first thing I'd say is trying to think holistically about the risk and not picking off such a small part of the risk that you end up maybe not coming up with a solution that is broad enough to deal with what you're really facing.
Okay. I don't know, Katie, if you wanted to add to that at all.
I'll just briefly say that I think a lot of state and local jurisdictions are increasingly looking at opportunities to consider hazard mitigation in the context of adaptation planning. So for some examples, if people are interested in, the state of Massachusetts has a combined state hazard mitigation and adaptation plan that could be looked at. For an example, Baltimore has a disaster preparedness plan that looks at also incorporating those two opportunities together. Other states like Minnesota, even if they aren't having an official joint hazard mitigation and adaptation plan, are looking at how they can incorporate climate risk into future updates to their federally required hazard mitigation plan. So I think this is something that jurisdictions are increasingly realizing. A lot of it, I think, is just being able to have tools to integrate the two together and peer learning to inform that process.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question, challenging a little bit. I'm surprised that you would suggest that we divest from recovery in coastal areas. I understand the pragmatic need to plan for resilience, but we can not simply uproot millions of people. Where would they go? What would happen to their lands or homes? What about the rights to their land?
Well, I can start on that. There are a couple of different questions there. One is the legal question that maybe I'll let Katie talk about. But in general terms, clearly we have a force of nature we are having to come to grips with, both in terms of more severe storms and rising seas. That's going to require changes. Either we get ahead of those changes, or the changes come at us in a destructive and even catastrophic way when major hurricanes come through. So it's really important to be thinking ahead and thinking about what the best solutions are. There are cases where a protection strategy is going to make sense, given what needs to be protected and the time frame that's involved. But in many cases, it's going to be necessary to look at people's health and safety and ultimately managing their financial assets in a way that gradually steps back from the coast rather than waits for this catastrophic storm impact that we then spend billions of federal dollars to address. So I guess I'd say it's important to think in terms of not just, well, we can build seawalls, but also in terms of what are the alternatives that are going to last longer and protect not just the community, but ecosystems and infrastructure as well.
That's right. And I'll add, through the Georgetown Climate Center's work on managed retreat, we've been fortunate to engage with hundreds of stakeholders from across the country at the federal, state, local, and community level, and also academic experts on what are sort of these like basic minimum or required components that policymakers should think about for implementing retreat strategies. And the most clear and consistent feedback we've heard is that these decisions need to be community-based, community-driven, and sort of bottom-up, as you would call it, rather than top-down. And they should be voluntary, and eminent domain, or what might be called involuntary buyouts, is sort of only used in really special circumstances. So with the idea of working with and engaging communities to educate them about and learn about the risks that they're facing, hopefully that will inform potential retreat decisions going forward. And as I mentioned, then it's about thinking not just getting people out of harm's way, but also about where are they going and what will that look like for them to facilitate better transitions. With these discussions, I think Jeff and I are both in agreement that retreat isn't going to happen everywhere, and it's going to be this large scale. Nobody lives on the coast anymore. Cultures historically, especially frontline communities, tribal communities, and anyone, I feel like I personally maintain important connections to the water. And so it's about how can we re-envision our coasts, or our new coast, as Jeff says, to make it better and safer, and look at doing it in a managed or planned or coordinated way, so that way we're able to minimize the various costs from economic to social to psychological, rather than just waiting for a storm and doing it in this haphazard way that results in greater costs to society and the environment.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. I know of very few examples of using fiscal impact analysis to measure the impacts of property buyouts. For example, three examples in New Jersey, but none elsewhere. Do you know of any examples where this has been done?
Let's see. So I'm unfamiliar with the exact term sort of fiscal impact analysis, but I'm assuming that means, what is sort of almost like a benefit cost analysis of buyouts, and what are potential return on investments from communities from expending funds to buyout properties. So Charlotte-Mecklenburg actually is a good example. That's how they essentially got their sort of greater than 400% return on investment. Again, sort of back of the envelope calculation for spending about 15 million on buyouts. And they take a really holistic and comprehensive approach to looking at, things I think beyond sort of the Federal Emergency Management Agency benefit cost analysis calculations, to really thinking about all of the benefits that you get from this. So what are the ecosystem services, what that can come from restoring bought out properties, how does this impact the emergency services costs that we'll have avoided by not having to go rescue people in a flood. So they're a good example of that.
Okay.
I'd just add that there has been some good work on looking at some of the financial implications and of comparing strategies like relocation or protection strategies. Just off the top of my head, researchers at Old Dominion University published a really interesting paper looking at relocation and its comparative long-term benefits. So I think there have been some careful reviews of some of the economic implications of some of these decisions.
Okay. Next question is, how can we get governments to address both flooding and increasing salinity seeping from coastal areas upstream?
Well, salinity is an issue in the context of coastal resilience. And to the extent that seas rise and drive salt water further inland than it would otherwise go, it poses a risk to different sectors. So as sources of fresh water may be contaminated with salt water, either as river water or more likely as groundwater. And practices, agricultural sector, businesses might be affected as salt water goes inland. It's a really hard problem to manage. You particularly in the case of groundwater, it's really hard to build a seawall underground, for instance. So you're going to have a certain amount of saltwater intrusion into coastal aquifers as seawater rises. And to some extent that can be dealt with by moving wells for public water systems to places further inland. But that is an important consequence of the long-term impact of sea level rise.
Yes, a more encompassing discussion of coastal resilience wouldn't just talk about sort of the flooding and land loss impacts that we talked about today, but also impacts to other resources like water. I'm aware that, for example, some states in the Chesapeake Bay have begun thinking about this issue. The state of Maryland recently released I believe the nation's first saltwater intrusion and salinization plan. This plan was required to be developed by the state legislature and ultimately looks at the state of knowledge and research on this question in the state so far, and ultimately proposes a future research agenda for the state to learn more and monitor this problem, and also potential policy actions going forward. So I think it's an opportunity for other states and local governments to learn from this example, to evaluate their own water situation for purposes of a broader idea of coastal resilience and adaptation, but also, thinking about how, adaptation in general is very interdisciplinary and cuts across different levels of government and stakeholders and agencies within those governments and communities. And so how do you bring, water planners, maybe people from the Environmental Protection Agency or, stormwater management agencies to the table into this discussion as well, and not just coastal managers and land use and zoning planners.
Great. Thank you, Katie. Thanks for mentioning that as well. And the Maryland example is one that our department's actually worked on, and our colleague Jason Dubow, and it will be available on our website to take a look at. And in fact, that kind of teed up the next question that we had received, which is kind of, and you mentioned one example, but what states are taking the lead to address the issues you have identified? And do you have any other examples of state plans that states and jurisdictions can look at?
Sure. So is the question state plans in terms of saltwater intrusion salinization, or more broadly in terms of coastal?
It's more broadly, like what's happening at the state level, and if there are some leaders that folks can look at for more information as well, in addition to the example you just used.
Sure. So I will selfishly refer people to Georgetown Climate Center's main website, georgetownclimate.org, and the state adaptation progress tracker that I mentioned earlier. It's a snapshot of states that have adaptation plans, and we also include a discussion in regard to states that are looking at coastal adaptation and how they're approaching that legislatively in terms of planning and working with communities. Some of the initial examples that come to mind include Louisiana. The state has what's called their coastal master plan, which is updated every 5 years to look at how the state will prioritize investments in its coast and the different strategies that we'll look at to adapt to climate change. California has a robust sea level rise planning process and works at the state and local level based on how their coastal management program is set up. Other states to watch too include Virginia, New Jersey, Texas just came out with a resilience plan, but those are states that are in the process of sort of beginning to think about this in terms of what they need to develop the plans in terms of plans at the state level.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add really quickly that the state of New Jersey has done a really groundbreaking assessment of sea level rise for the state coastline, drawing together some of the leading scientists in the field, looking at the specific circumstances and geography of the state of New Jersey. And that report just came out last year, and really I think sets a benchmark for how to do a great job of looking at localized projections of future sea level. And I would also endorse the reference to the work state of California is doing, is also looking hard at some of these questions and thinking carefully about what the policy options are.
Okay, thanks. Katie, a question came in as to when the Managed Retreat Toolkit will be launched. Is there a date?
So the content for the toolkit is currently in development and it will be released later this year. But if anyone is interested in being added to our distribution list, feel free to email me and I will add you to that. So you'll be the first to know when it comes out.
Great. Okay, so we're getting near the end of our time, so we'll just have a couple more questions here. I think another one for you, Katie. What are the funding sources for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg buyout program? Do you know that?
Yes, so the program today primarily uses local stormwater management fees to fund buyouts. So that's a local sustainable source of funding. When the program started, it did use different grants from the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, but as it has reduced its risk and basically generated greater revenue source through these stormwater fees, it's been able to rely primarily on this local funding source instead.
Okay. I have found that planning before the storm event makes it easier to make tough decisions from a theoretical perspective rather than immediately after the event. Do you have any examples of where this philosophy has worked or been used? Either of you?
Well, I think there are quite a lot of cases where we're seeing sort of proactive forward planning. Some that haven't been mentioned yet. South Florida is doing a great job looking at some of their long-term issues, and they've built a really great intergovernmental cooperative structure down there with bringing multiple counties and municipal jurisdictions together to look at long-range sea level rise risks as well as storm risks. And we've already talked about the great work going on in Norfolk. Los Angeles County's also done some pretty good long-range thinking about sea level rise and appropriate adaptation strategies.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add briefly, you know, there's so many different types of plans, I'm sure as much of our audience is aware. And so thinking about sort of that proactive planning that will help at post-disasters like with Norfolk. But I know Jeff mentioned, you know, different counties and municipalities in Florida and also Georgia that are developing what are called post-disaster redevelopment or recovery plans, which can be used exactly in that circumstance.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody who submitted questions. We're running out of time, so I'll ask one final one. How would local governments deal with an increase in land use density due to buyouts and relocations from coastal areas to receiving communities? Would relocated homes or businesses be relocated to greenfields or within a local jurisdiction's urban growth boundary?
So that's a good question. It's going to be location and place dependent, but I think some of the tools that local governments would look at are potentially upzoning areas within if they have an urban growth boundary, or areas potentially, we've looked at some examples where there's sort of infrastructure in place, but maybe there's underutilized development of affordable housing. So you can look at potentially looking at those areas first to incentivize or encourage new growth and development, because there's obviously a lot of benefits from preserving parks and open spaces and green space that I would believe there should be some type of prioritization measure to look at what land use and zoning tools you have to increase density in already developed higher ground areas and compared to sort of open space natural resource areas.
Great, thank you. So any final thoughts for our audience today?
Just really appreciate your attention and encourage everyone who's working in the coastal area to take a look at all of these problems, not just the storm surge, but also the long-range sea level rise impacts.
So I second that and appreciate the opportunity again to be here with you all today, even if just virtually. But the first step to coastal adaptation and resilience is starting the discussion in your own communities or at the state and federal level, even if those discussions can be difficult. So starting that, thinking about how it impacts communities, and you can bring them into this discussion, and how you can balance, short-term decisions and short-term risks with also longer-term decisions and longer-term risk.
Great. Thank you both. So with that, we'll conclude our webinar today, Strategies for Coastal Resilience, How Communities Need to Adapt. I would like to offer an extremely large thank you to Jeff and Katie for their excellent presentations, to Jen Hawes of Island Press for her behind the scenes work today, to our colleague Lisa Seamus of the American Association of Geographers, who's helped us with this webinar series and continues to support the Smart Growth Network, to all of you in the audience who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org next week. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few minutes to provide our feedback to us so we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our e-newsletters for details on other future webinars, including the next one on March 27th with David Rouse and Ben Hitchings, two esteemed fellows of the American Planning Association, for a presentation entitled ProAct Now, Planning Effectively in a Rapidly Changing World. Quite a relevant topic today. Have a great day.